Hey guys, I just want to let you know that I am now a certified spiritual life coach. If you resonate with the topics and lessons that my guests and I discuss on my podcast, and you feel that you could use some empowerment and direction in your journey of becoming who you truly are, consider booking a free discovery call with me on my website at kindlemccullough.com. And now on to the episode. Hey guys, I'm excited today. I have my friend Sorina Higgins, also a former colleague in grad school. She's been on the podcast twice. We had really awesome conversations, and she contacted me about speaking again. And I said, "Yeah, it's great topic, and whenever you come on, you have great stuff to say. And we have great conversations. So, thank you for joining again."
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, definitely. Just for those who may have not heard your other two episodes, just a little bit of background about yourself and who are you, what you do.
Sure. I have a PhD in English from Baylor University, and I specialized in magic and modern theater. And I study the Inklings as well as some modernist writers. And I'm really interested in alternative spiritualities and why people believe what they do, especially if they believe weird or dangerous things, and how they then put that into practice and how it influences the literature that they write.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, that's some of the things we talked about before. Today, I think we're going to be talking about ideas worth preserving, and also using the book Fahrenheit 451 as kind of to introduce or talk around that topic.
That's right. Yeah. For those who maybe haven't read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, it's just this awesome, I guess you could say dystopian novel, but it's really more of sort of a novel of ideas. It's set in a futuristic society in which books are illegal. And our main character is a fireman, not somebody who puts out fires, but somebody who starts fires to burn books. So he breaks into people's houses and searches for hidden libraries and then burns the books. But of course, as naturally would happen, he starts getting in touch with the underground, the people who want to save the books, and he starts being infected by their ideology. And I am going to spoil the end of the book here because it's important for what we're talking about. So if somebody doesn't want to know the ending, they'll have to just fast forward 30 seconds or something. At the end of the book, our main character meets a whole community of people who are saving works of literature, but they're doing it the only safe way they can in this totalitarian society. Each one has memorized a whole work of literature, and they spend hours every day just walking around reciting these books out loud wherever they are outdoors. So they each have chosen a book to preserve. And so there's a fascinating idea that we have a book about the preservation of books. This is actually a really common theme in literature. I'll bet you can think of others that are about how do we save the literature and why does it matter? What does it do? Sometimes it goes the other way, that books can be dangerous as well.
Yeah, that's a great premise. Very interesting. Takes censorship to a whole new level, and kind of also brings to mind the Middle Ages and kind of witch hunting and labeling certain things as evil, and what should be preserved and what should be censored. Have you ever seen the movie The Book of Eli?
I have not.
Okay.
Is it a similar premise?
Well, in the sense of Denzel Washington's the main character, and it's kind of, again, this dystopian, and there's not really literature and teaching, stuff like that, but he has a book that he's preserving that he finds great meaning to. And
Right.
Again, spoilers at the end, he turns out to be blind, and it's in Braille, so it's like no one else can read it. So he's the key that holds this wisdom, and I believe the book is the Bible. So that's what brought to mind when you were talking about that. So about people preserving it, memorizing, so they are themselves the key.
They are themselves the books. They're walking around with the book, and if it weren't for them, it wouldn't exist. I've just finished reading an absolutely brilliant, more recent novel, Children of Time, by Andrei Tchaikovsky. absolute genius. And it takes place over thousands and thousands of years. And there's one character who goes through it all. They have cryogenics, so that they can go into sleep for thousands of years, so that one person can live across this long, long story. And he's a classicist. So he studies together history, language, literature, philology, linguistics. And by the end, he is the single repository of knowledge of what came before. And really, if you were to sum up this novel, it's philology wins, which is an awesome message. Those who study language have the insight into reality that everyone else misses. And there's so many others. I'm thinking of Canticle for Leibowitz, which has sort of a future post-apocalyptic, again, trying to preserve the scriptures. The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco has a magical, mysterious library and a missing book in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess it makes sense that authors would write books about preserving books and knowledge.
Right. A little bit self-serving, maybe. Here's why we're so important. But obviously, writers wouldn't commit their lives to that if they didn't think it was that important. Mm-hmm. But this has got me thinking about the bigger ideas of what gets passed on in a culture and why it matters. So at the same time that I'm thinking about this, I'm also writing lectures about the Inklings for one of the great courses by the teaching company. And so there I've been thinking about what is it that these writers, the Inklings, all have in common, because they were quite a diverse group. We tend to think only about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, but there was also Charles Williams, who was an occult master. There was Owen Barfield, who was an anthroposophist, Cecil Harwood on the edges of the group, another anthroposophist. And I've started studying the lesser known members of the group and looking at the great diversity of thoughts they had, but also trying to boil it down, like if there was one thing they all agreed on, what was it? And I'm going to say it as if it's two things, but you might see how they're interrelated, or we can tease it out. Thing one is read old books, learn old stories, preserve and pass on dead languages. But the second, this one feels more personal. So we feel like stuff matters. When things happen to us, we feel like it matters. If we fall in love, have a baby, have a terrible illness, have a great grief or a loss, we feel like it matters on like a galactic scale. But depending on one's worldview, that may just be a delusion. If we are just biochemical, just material things, then that doesn't actually matter. It's a delusion created in us by our cognitive soup, right? But I think that all these writers agreed that, no, that's true. When you feel like these things matter, you're right. And so now to try to take those two things and bring them together, they said the stories that get passed on generation after generation after generation tell us why those things matter and what their significance is. So they didn't want us to get cut off from that tradition. Does that make a certain amount of sense?
Oh yeah, definitely. What comes to mind is we don't have to get too into it, but spiral dynamics and kind of like protecting against modernism, this belief in forever progress and technology and science and production or achievement, but losing the deeper sense of spirituality and meaning and community and relationship and the fruits of the spirit, all these different more intangible things. And most of the Inklings, or at least the ones that we think of more frequently, the Lewis brothers and Tolkien, they would say, well, the reason those things in your life matter is that they are small examples, they are microcosms of those things happening in the big story, the macrocosm. So, the Christ narrative. So I'll pick the example of, I mentioned, like if you fall in love. Well, so a lot of writers across history have used romantic relationships in general and marriage specifically as an image of, say, Christ and the church, because it's an image of this committed love that goes on forever and then involves an awful lot of self-sacrifice. So they've used that, and also a union, a bringing together of two who are different, to have them in some sort of a new unity, a oneness. So there's an example. They would say, well,
the reason you feel like it matters when you fall in love or get in a relationship or get married or when a relationship ends is because it does matter, because it's not just a symbol, but almost like a happening of that great union of Christ and the church, or the divine and the soul, happening in a smaller scale in your own life.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, everybody's in search of contentment and fulfillment. And, people find out that the American dream, or making it, whether that's, getting a lot of money or being popular, or et cetera, these type of things don't actually fulfill us. And,
Right.
a lot of people, as they get older, start to realize how important religion, spirituality, and these things are actually what give us lasting fulfillment in that relationship and a love and giving that we have for others, and gratitude towards life. These are the ultimate things that give us fulfillment, and it's not so much the external things that we achieve.
Right. Yeah. So these authors thought that we needed old books and ancient stories in order to understand that. So that seems a little odd. So if you or I had never read an old book in our lives, would we still, search for spirituality and look for meaning in relationships and in community and all that? Well, yes, they would say that's because that's how humans are designed. But they thought that if we had these stories as models and guides, and even as community, that we'd be able to understand more sort of why we're built that way. Because you've mentioned community, and I've said that word a couple times now. So they thought that the community of the dead is also really, really important. That it's not enough to just know people of your own time, because they said every time period has its own intellectual weaknesses and has its own cultural faults, and that we need something to set against today by which we can not necessarily judge today, but put it into perspective.
Context.
And because we don't have access to the future, they said what we need is the works of the past. Now, I would also say what we can do is look at other cultures as well, because a culture that's very different from ours at exactly the same moment in time is a little bit like reading old literature, because it's getting into a different mindset, a different cultural worldview, a different perspective, and so forth. They maybe didn't have quite as much access to that as we do today.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Well, I think about the different types of genres of books, and like history, knowing about the past is really important, and not repeating the same mistakes. And I think blind spots is another word of basically what you're saying. But I also, obviously we both love fantasy, and I love sci-fi. I don't know how much you love sci-fi, but
yes.
Yes, awesome. But these things are not necessarily the past, but I think that fantasy specifically helps you imagine different universes, different magic of the world in a different way, but that helps open up your imagination, which helps you change. It can help you grow. And so you need imagination to imagine yourself different, or how do I overcome challenges? It takes imagination. So in the microcosm, but also the macrocosm, how do we change our culture? How do we get unstuck from the modern problems we have? And then sci-fi is let's imagine if the future were like this. And so it can help us imagine or connect with the way culture is today, and are we going towards that, or how we alike and how we different, and how do we want to think about how we want to continue to shape the future? Do we want to keep going down this path or go down this path? And it creates dialogue about how accurate is this book, or if we go along this path, is it going to be like this? And so we have to be careful, or this is the path we want. So it just helps. Really, I think it's the undercover or invisible marker of conscious of shaping our whole society's focus and where they want to go from there.
Yes, and fantasy and science fiction and other speculative forms of literature take a real issue or topic or idea and put it into focus in a way they couldn't if it were wholly realistic. Because when it's totally realistic, then we can't get away from the perspective that we have on the issue. So let's take, for instance, the issue of American racism. So our country has a very particular heritage of tension between people of different backgrounds. Obviously, every culture has prejudice and racism and discrimination, but as Americans, we have to look at our particular one. Well, obviously, it's very good to read history and sociology and economics and all the nonfiction works that analyze this in the real context. But we could also read a work of fantasy that has two different rational species encountering each other. The phrase we use is fantastic racism, not meaning that racism is fantastic, but racism in a fantasy setting. And so when we look at how two totally different species interact in this fantasy world, it can clarify the real world situation for us, because it can sort of pare away all the baggage of American history and some of the ways that we might struggle with guilt or resistance or other sort of mental blocks that we have to looking at the issue. So maybe if we look, for instance, at dwarfs and elves hate each other and have this long history of resistance to each other and of misunderstanding and despising each other's cultures, and then two of them become very good friends and then visit each other's cultures and get beyond that barrier, learn each other's languages and learn what each other value. That can maybe help us to see the issue, like I say, without a lot of the baggage that we bring to it. That's just one possible example. Or they can help us to look at bioethical or techno-ethical issues by taking one that's an extreme version of something we're facing right now. So, for instance, a lot of science fiction deal with bioethical and techno-ethical questions have to do with reproduction. So, for instance, like, well, what if we could totally clone, 100% make designer babies, like in Gattaca, say, or what if the human race goes sterile, is infertile, and there's no new children? Or what if we're in a situation where it's not safe to raise children, and so we have to harvest all the embryos and bottle them up and then raise them in a future time? So we don't have exactly those ethical questions, but we have ones that are on that trajectory with the choices that we make about in vitro fertilization and different choices about reproduction. So again, science fiction and other speculative forms can take that, and by like blowing it up to an extreme can kind of force us to face the questions and say, well, what ought we to do in these situations? And that's good, because it can't always be faced legally. Like the laws lag behind technological advancements to a significant degree. So AI is the big one right now. That we're on the cusp of generative AI. We don't actually have it yet, even though that's what it's called. It's not truly generative, and it's not a self. I forget. No, there's another word that I'm looking for right now. It's not a continuous learning system yet. So it's not a live continuous learning system yet. But like, we don't have laws right now, and educators are struggling to learn how to integrate this, and creative people are struggling to learn what to do with it. So we can look at science fiction that has fully autonomous, fully continuous learning, maybe even sentient AI, and that can help us to have the intelligent conversations about what to do. That's the theory, anyway.
Yeah. I definitely think sci-fi helps us think about ethics and the future ethics, and like you said, law is always lagging behind. So, what do we do while things are advancing so fast? We have to think about that. Right. So books help us think ahead. Yeah. So I think this relates to the idea of censorship too. Can I give a little example of actually a talk I heard at Baylor about censorship? And he was talking about how censorship doesn't actually work because people actually need to be triggered a little bit in books, because when hard things in life happen, the people that had been exposed to more intense things in books were better able to handle that because they were exposed to some degree in books. And so that was one really interesting
That's
point.
fascinating.
Yeah.
So I think it's Chesterton who said, when he was defending scary scenes in kids' books, he says, fairy tales introduce children to dragons, and we shouldn't protect them from that because they need to know not that dragons exist, they're going to know that, but that dragons can be defeated.
I love that.
That's really good. Yeah, similarly with my students at Baylor, I asked them what they wanted as far as content warnings and trigger warnings and being excused from having to encounter difficult content. And they universally said, feel free to give us the warnings. We appreciate that, but don't censor the material. Trust us to handle the material, but it would be kind if you just tell us sort of what type of difficult content is coming up so that we can prepare ourselves. But yeah, don't take it from, we need to read this.
Right.
We need to know what's there. Yeah. So do you think there's any material that should be censored, that should not be preserved?
That's a good question. I think there is something to psychological development. And maybe like a certain age, people should be exposed to things and I mean too, like if you do have like say PTSD from some traumatic experience, like maybe that same kind of experience in a book, maybe that you're not ready for that or you haven't healed enough for that. So it's not a blanket statement saying for everything, everyone should be exposed in every age to everything. But definitely not so extreme as some groups might put it. So, when it comes to like violence or sexual things, I do think that like a certain age, and also that might depend on the person, people develop at different time periods than others. I mean, there's a general thing. So, but again, I think that ultimately it's up to the family's discretion, the parents.
But what about the larger scale preservation of material, though? So I'm thinking about this in terms of a specific conference that you and I will talk about a little bit later on, that's being hosted at the Internet Archive. And so for those of your listeners who might not know, do check it out. The Internet Archive is several things, but among other things, it is a massive online library. Their goal is to digitize everything digitizable that humans have ever made. So every piece of text, sound, or video, they want to digitize that. And they would like to make it freely available, so they have some challenges with copyright sometimes. But at least they want to make it that people can borrow this material, just like walking down to your public library, but have it in a digital form. And they really stepped up during COVID to try to make materials available when people could not go into their public library or their university library as easily. But in addition to facing some copyright challenges, they've also faced some accusations that they're preserving material that should be destroyed. And the two biggest examples are hardcore pornography and material like from extremist terrorists, sort of like manifesto materials, or like extremely violent hateful materials. So those are the two things. So like, should we as a human race decide that there are some books that ought to be burned?
Right. What's coming to mind is I was a student and then a staffer at this Christian apologetics conference, actually right before I went to Baylor.
Okay.
And they said, read Mein Kampf, the book that Hitler wrote. That like read that so you know what evil is, so you know what to avoid, to not do. And it even makes me think of like the Screw Tape Letters, which C.S. Lewis wrote about an elder demon talking to a younger demon about how to tempt a human and towards evil and away from God. But at the same time, I think both of those they have the understanding that these people already have a foundation of what's good and what's right to compare it with. Not that somebody who has no idea what good is and what's right will just be exposed to this and radicalize. And things like very violent and pornographic, and that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, like, is there some material that should not be allowed to exist, that should
Right.
be destroyed?
Hmm. That's a
Yeah,
tough one. Even talking about like social media and like hate speech and what's
right.
allowed, what's not, what's good, but there's so much subjectivity, and it gets very like
Hmm.
political, or this type of materials accepted because it fits our group narrative, and this is not, and this is hate,
Right.
or even could go into like um, the whole like health debate of like what is false
Hmm.
information,
Right.
like
Right.
people arguing about COVID and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Um,
Because we have seen, I mean, you've been saying wisely that people need a certain level of discernment before they encounter specific
right.
material.
Hmm.
But who is to determine what that level of discernment is, and who's going to
Hmm.
police who gets access to it? And as we've seen our own country believing two different narratives on COVID, on elections, on certain other political topics. Yeah. So is it just whoever's in power determines what material gets promulgated and what material gets destroyed?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we have a new, an even greater quandary today because of the internet and how much information is out there, and social media, the news, and the ways we're exposed to things. And it's a whole new level to a whole vast array of people, that anybody that has access to these things. And it's very
Hmm.
easy to get access. So it's hard to, you could say in the past, like, well, based on these groups and these circles that we're in, we can decide for that circle what's good and what's not and what people are ready for. But now that pretty much everyone has access to these things, it's a lot harder question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, again, it's really, to me, about relationship and community. And so having people around you that you're all looking out for each other, you're all discussing, um, so that you're not alone, and you're not just being exposed. You're exposed to a multitude of different kind of things, and so hopefully you'll get, if you're exposed to bad things, you're exposed to good things, and so you'll have that contrast so that you can then make a decision yourself, instead of just being exposed to very, evil things that are really going to put you astray. You think that's all there is, or you don't know a better way.
Hmm. Hmm. I was in England a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to see a theater production in London, but it was a Sunday, and the regular West End theater doesn't play on Sunday. Plus, it costs approximately a month's mortgage payment to see a play. So I went to see a small scale sort of community theater production. It was a dramatic, immersive, interactive production of George Orwell's 1984.
Mm. Hmm.
And I asked myself, why are you doing this to yourself? This is not going to be fun. And it was, of course, incredibly intense. And
Hmm.
they got the audience involved, like pretending that we were being recruited to the party and that we had to like sign up and be brainwashed as loyal party members. So we got ID badges and armbands and stuff. And we were asked questions at different times. But in case some people don't remember, one theme or one thread in that story is that our main character, Winston Smith, has a job of rewriting history whenever the party decides that it has to change. So, for instance, the party will often erase people. They'll cause someone to disappear, and then all reference to that person has to be erased from newspapers, history books, film reels, things like that. And his specific work assignment is newspapers. So he goes back through all the newspapers and finds any reference to this person who has been murdered and disappeared. And he changes those references. He cuts them out if it's a small one, or he rewrites a story. And they literally then reprint all the newspapers from the past that reference that. It's so much easier now digitally, but they had to do this physically, reprint all the newspapers, books, magazines, everything to rewrite the past. And they did it constantly. And then there's a very disturbing philosophical argument towards the end, which is, where does the past exist?
Mm.
In documents. Okay, but those can be changed. In my memory. But you have no way of confirming your memory if there's
Hmm.
no documentary evidence. And if nobody else remembers it, how do you know that you're not crazy and imagining it? So I think that all of these things we're talking about are reasons that we need not only communities, but communities of culture and of interpretation, that we have certain old books that we all read and discuss. They're not guarantees. They're not guarantees that these things won't happen, because you could take let's say, two small classical school communities in America, and you could have them still believing opposite interpretations of today's news and current events. But being a teacher myself, I think there's something to be said for education and a certain amount of a shared cultural education and a passing down of the great values that have been valued by every culture across time and space, and that have been preserved in the works that last. So it's a little harder to know what, like, for instance, what's a great classic right now? We think we know, we have a good guess, but we need to wait 1,000 years and see whether everyone is still reading it. But if we all read some of the great classics, not only of the quote unquote Western tradition, the Greeks and the Romans and so forth, but some of the great works of multiple cultures, we'll see that they have certain civic virtues, family virtues, personal and communal values and ethics, and that should provide some foundation. So, yeah, go ahead, and then I'll come back to my other question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I actually read 1984 right before grad school at Baylor, and I actually did a lot of my papers using 1984.
Nice.
And it is very dark, but it's also so great. And I think it speaks to the danger in censorship, in the sense that the less you're exposed to, the more likely you can be bamboozled. You can be like, this is the way, and you can become indoctrinated. And not realize there's other ways of thinking and other perspectives. And what I was thinking is actually my favorite stories are not ones that are totally light and happy, or are not totally dark. Like 1984 has a lot of great points, but even that is very dark, and it's not really a happy ending. But my favorite stories are the ones who have great darkness and evil, and they're not shy about talking about these things, but they find a way to alchemize. They found a way to, how do we make sense of this? How do we make good out of this? How do we transform it, and persevere through it? And those are, I think, my favorite stories. And so sometimes I can see, like, within the Christian culture, us being scared to talk about the evil fully, and the stories kind of, they lack a depth to them that some older stories have. And also what you're speaking to in the sense of finding the similarities in all these older stories. And I'm really a big fan of Joseph Campbell, and he has studied lots of different cultures and finds collective archetypes and symbols. And that's what I found in my own journey. And that's why he resonated with me so much, because reading so many books before I got to Campbell, I was like, I see so many similarities, and it helps bring this commonality, this humanity that we're all struggling with, we're all trying to make sense of, and we're all trying to find these meaning and purpose and love and connection. And so it just helps highlight humanity and our shared oneness, despite different religions, despite different cultures, all these different things. There's something deeper that's shared, that we can have this empathy and love and connection if we can make that work.
Yeah, unity is another big theme that these writers come back to over and over again. And the writer that I study the most, Charles Williams, what he hated more than anything was schism, was divisions between things. When people got divided, when the church got divided, for instance, he hated the big schisms of the church in the past, so he wrote them out of his fictional history. When you're separated from someone you love and you can no longer talk to them, he just felt like he couldn't deal with that. And yet he believed that you could measure the quality of a literary author by how well they faced that schism in their works, by how well they characterize it, and then somehow go beyond it and come to what he oddly called a promulgation of sacred union, which is a very odd Charles Williamsian phrase, but it's the idea that there's a union beyond something purely material, right? It's not just when you take ingredients and mix them together, but it's when the spiritual and the physical somehow come together.
Yeah.
A unity of body, soul, and spirit, and of multiple souls and spirits, especially of people who have been divided by those schisms.
I was listening to Ram Dass. He's one of my favorites today, and he was talking about love and how when you fall in love, you think that love is a love for a certain person, and to some degree that's true. But that love is actually this shared something. He said he loved his guru, and when his guru was on his deathbed, they were all mourning that he was going to leave, and he's like, what are you talking about? Where could I go? Like, once I leave, this love will still be there. This love is inside of you. It's inside of me. It's this shared, deeper foundation that we all have inside. And so other people can help us find that, but it's not like it's not there before or after them. And so, when people come into a relationship or like a marriage or something like that, they're finding this shared oneness of love that is the foundation of reality, really, I think. And it's there whether they're not there or not. And so that's something intangible. Yeah, it's hard to
That sounds like that's
language to.
His version of John Donne's A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. So that's somebody who finds the language for it. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say no. So let us melt and make no noise. No tear floods or sigh tempests move. 'Twere profanation of our joys to tell the laity our love. And so he goes on and says, let's not mourn, sweetheart, even though you and I are being separated, because our two loves, therefore, which are one, endure not yet a breach, but then expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. So he pictures that they are united by a golden wire, and the blacksmith, the goldsmith, can hammer out that piece of gold thinner and thinner and thinner as the two lovers get further and further away, but that it's never severed. It just gets thinner and thinner and thinner. And that's the poem that ends with the famous metaphor of the compass, the circle drawing instrument, and they're each 1 foot of it. And so the one stays at home and the other goes around, but the one at home, thy firmness makes my circle just and makes me end where I begun. So he finds language and images and metaphors for the idea of that, spiritual connection that can be stretched and stretched and stretched and stretched, but not broken.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that not just stretched, but it's like once you realize that it comes from within, then you can start to connect with it more and cultivate that and find that love for everything for all time. And it's not about this attachment to a certain object and this fearing of I'm going to lose it, then I'm going to lose this love. It's like, no, I can find that through whatever happens.
That sounds lovely.
Daunting. Yeah, lovely and hard, and the journey to do that.
One thing I would add as a difference for the sake of dialogue is that the tradition I'm coming from and most of these writers I'm studying come from don't say you find it within. And that's a pretty big difference between them and other spiritual traditions, is that they say, no, absolutely not. It's external. They say there's a difference between the creator and the creature, and the divine is not found within. That, the divine has to reach down and reach into you. And that if you look within to find it, you'll end up shriveling inward and never, ever finding that connection. Because for them, love is a personal name, capital L. It is the name of an individual person. It's another one of Jesus' names. And so they would say, don't look inward, look outward.
Yeah, Yeah. I think that at the end of the day, it's the language is it just falls short of the connection to love in whatever way you find that. It amounts to the same thing at the end of the day. But that's just my personal opinion. I don't want to like get too sidetracked with what we're
Right,
focused on.
right, exactly. But being a writer as well, the language is always going to fall short, but we're always going to try to find it. And that's
Yes.
why we have so many of these works that we love, that we read, that we keep coming back to. Yeah. I mean, and they talk about their own limits. I mean, how many poets end up saying, I can't describe it to you, and then go on and try anyway?
Right.
I mean, Dante says that so many times, and more and more and more as he gets into the Paradiso. He can find words to describe the torments of hell, but it's harder and harder to find words to describe the glories of heaven. And so many writers do that. They use fragments, and they use suggestivity, and they use sort of like dropping the curtain on the scene just before the scene is full. So like the end of my favorite book, Till We Have Faces, the god is coming into his palace, and the vision ends right before we could actually see the god, because there's no language that could actually describe him or describe that experience. But the mystics, the ecstatics, the visionaries always try to communicate it, either through words or maybe through, painting or music or dance or some other artistic medium. But we keep trying to communicate it. And that's why there's so many great books for us to read.
Yeah, I agree. And I feel the same thing within me. And I think that books are so amazing in finding, again, that relationship, that connection. Like, oh, they're putting words to something I had in my mind or my feeling, but I didn't know how to express it. I didn't know how to say it. And, oh, here's someone who is onto what I'm feeling or feels the same way or thinks the same things. And so it helps us with our loneliness and meaning making, and helps us think how we can express it better, and then talk and communicate to each other and find more connection than we might have if we hadn't read in the first place.
Right. They say what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. And so it provides another sense of community, that sort of that spark of understanding across generations, across centuries, across cultures. When we say, oh, you've experienced that too? And oh, you said it better than I ever could. Yeah.
Yes.
So that's why then I'm helping to organize a conference on this topic, because I want people to explore it. So the conference is at the Internet Archive in San Francisco, the last day of January and the first day of February 2025. Fahrenheit 2451, we call it. So a little over 400 years from now, what would you want to make sure still exists? What book would you memorize if you were one of Ray Bradbury's people? And what are the challenges of preservation? So everything you and I have just been discussing will have papers on them. And we have a nice range of papers on literature, theology, religious studies, art, I think maybe architecture. So we have different approaches, and we have really amazing keynote speakers. The first keynote speaker is Owen A. Barfield, the grandson of the Inkling, Barfield. So awesome. He'll be talking to us about his grandfather's ideas, perhaps his great preservation work in trying to get more of his grandfather's works published and disseminated. And then we have Crystal and David Downing, who previously co-directed the Marion E. Wade Center, which is an archive for preserving the works of some of the Inklings and a few other related writers. And David will be talking about the preservation of C.S. Lewis's works. And I believe that Crystal will be talking about evolving symbolic systems of communication as ways of preserving and transmitting wisdom, because she also studies semiotics and critical theory and post-structuralism. So it should be pretty awesome. And then we'll do a really fun version of this, which is we'll watch some movie clips and talk about adaptation as a mode of saving and bringing ideas along. So we'll have one night on Star Wars and one night on Lord of the Rings, where we'll watch these and have a smart panel of folks talking about, the texts and their adaptations and, other iterations of them and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Talk about how the Rings of Power is shameful.
Yeah, that was one of the topics that I suggested. I phrased it as the Rings of Power and the ethics of adaptation. I decided to phrase it like that, but amen. Awesome acting between the two Charlies, Charles Edwards and Charlie Vickers, but yes, very poor writing across the series.
Yeah. But I love that. One thing when you brought up this topic, I was thinking about the Bible, and, obviously I think the Bible is amazing. There's lots of great things to take from it, and we should continue to read and interpret and make sense of. But, there are some Christians who are like, the Bible is all we need. And I'm like, why do we have sermons? Why do we have books, Bible study, other books, other things? I'm like, and why are we still talking, if it has everything, and so what I'm getting at is that we still have to interpret the meanings into our modern lives and into our individual context. And, there is something, just because the way culture is, that we lose some things that we have to, and I think it's helpful to go back and be like, what was the culture like then? And so this parable about, a shepherd, what did that mean? Because we don't have shepherds in our modern lives around us that we can really understand the full context. And also, if we can take these same lessons we're learning, and if we can apply them into modern lives, adaptation, maybe that we can gain even more, or help us understand the context of what it's trying to say in this different parable. And so we continually need to evolve as our way of life and culture and everything else evolves into preserving these truths, but also continuing to discover new truths or new ways of applying it. Yes,
applying them as the circumstances change. And for some reason, the way human beings are, when we see a book that we love, one of the ways that we wave at it and say hello, thank you, is we write one in response. So good writing generates writing.
It's inspirational.
Yeah, it is. It's inspirational. So we're, as long as we are the human race, we're going to keep writing and telling stories. But I hope that we keep reading the old ones, adapting them as well. But I hope we keep going back to them, even though we find really challenging content. And as our sensibilities change and as we focus on different areas of human rights, then different things jump out to us. But that doesn't mean that we therefore don't engage with the texts. We still engage with them, and we discuss all of that content.
And, definitely there's always beautiful things to hold on to from old books that they teach us, or maybe we've forgotten in our modern culture that we've lost to reestablish. But sometimes we can see, what? We've actually, our ethics, our morals are better than this, than they were in the past, and we can have some self-love for that as well.
And then, as C.S. Lewis says, find something else to set against ours so that we find what you called our blind spots as well.
Exactly. Yes. Both ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kendall. This was a pretty wide-ranging conversation, but we also got into some specifics. I thought that was good.
Yeah,
we dug down a little bit.
That's how my brain works. So
nice.
This is home for me.
Well, it'd be awesome if you could come to the conference, and dear listeners, it'd be awesome if you could come. There's still a couple weeks to get in a paper proposal. So check out ideasworthsaving.org.
I'll make sure I'll put it in the podcast notes.
Awesome.
Like you said, this conversation has been amazing. It's been really fun, and I always enjoy your thoughts and your depth of research and experience, and what you bring to the table, and just your energy of joyfulness.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.